So that brings us to today, and that's the scenario that we're faced with. We've definitely got a very well-defined problem, and we're hoping now that we're looking at a window of opportunity, that we can actually get something done about this problem. Now, Kingdon is a sociologist who studies what components have to be in place to actually affect major social change in the United States. And he describes a situation where three things have to come together to actually cause that window of opportunity to open. The three things are that you have a well-defined problem, which I think we do, that there's the political will to do something about the problem. And I would say, despite all of the rhetoric, that members of both political parties agree that we actually need to do something about our current healthcare system. There's not actually disagreement on the fact that we need to act. The disagreement comes into what is the action. And then the third piece of this is that there's a policy solution that is willing to be supported by enough votes in Congress that it can actually be turned into law. And that's where we run into trouble. And there are many questions about the policy solution and what it should look like. They're philosophical and practical. The themes of this were featured prominently in the 2008 presidential campaign. And they come down to, at a very fundamental level, this question: is healthcare a privilege or a right? And I'm sure everyone in this audience has an immediate answer to that question, if they think healthcare is a privilege, or if that society has some obligation to its community to make sure everybody has access to care. If we walked out onto Locust Street and stopped 10 people, they would also all be able to tell you exactly how they felt about that. And how do you think this comes out in this country? What percentage of people do you think believe that healthcare is a right? Any thoughts? Oh, come on, somebody can make a guess. How much? 60? It's actually 50%. And 50% feel that you're on your own. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps and figure it out. And it really doesn't matter who you ask that question to. Physicians have been asked this question, and for the most part, they come out about 50-50 too. So it's just one of those things, and that's part of why we struggle and have so much acrimony over this issue of how to get healthcare reform done, the actual process of it, because people are pretty evenly split in the United States on this most fundamental question. So the answer to that question then drives all sorts of policy solutions around how to solve the problem. So for instance, are costs best controlled by market-based solutions, like just put it into the free market, or is there an increased role for federal government necessary? Is this an individual responsibility, or does society have some responsibility? And then we have a whole host of very, very contentious issues that has just been ripping Congress apart on both sides of the aisle. And these issues tend to transcend which party you're in. One is whether or not undocumented persons should be covered by this plan, or only American citizens or legal immigrants. And the second one is about reproductive rights and whether or not there should be further tightening of rules around abortion services and federal dollars around that, or if the status quo is acceptable. And these things are just ripping the bill apart to some extent. So the last time that we had an opportunity to try to get this done was in 1992, when President Clinton and then Mrs. Clinton were working on this problem. We had a pretty bad problem then, although not nearly as bad as it is today. Lots of political will. President Clinton was very, very committed to solving this. And the problem came up in terms of the policy solution that was created. President Clinton put 100 people into a room, a lot of policy experts and others, and told them to put together a plan, which they did. It was developed largely in secret. There wasn't a lot of consensus building among the stakeholders. And then President Clinton delivered this plan to Congress, and Congress said, whoa, this is big, this is complicated, we didn't write this bill. You're expecting us to make difficult votes on this bill that we didn't write? And they sort of threw up their hands. The pharmaceutical industry, the private health insurance companies just piled on with negative advertisements, and very quickly, actually, that bill had failed. So President Obama took the completely 180-degree approach to this. He simply articulated a set of principles in early February, shortly after the inauguration, and then he told Congress to go ahead and write the bills. So this was a strategy that he hoped would sort of keep everybody at the table, keep the insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and everybody at the table. And actually, that's largely been the case through most of this effort. So what happened next? Well, in the House of Representatives, there's 3 committees that have jurisdiction over pieces of health care. And they actually came together and wrote one bill. This had never happened before, actually. They formed a tri-committee, and they wrote one bill, and that bill was introduced in July before the August recess, and they passed it in November. In the Senate, there's 2 committees of jurisdiction over health care. One is the Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. That was Senator Kennedy's committee. And the second is the Finance Committee. And the Health Committee moved pretty quickly. Their bill was done by, I think, September or so, maybe early October. But the Finance Committee was a huge problem. And that was a place where the Gang of 6, which was, came out of, which was 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, who labored mightily to come up with some sort of bipartisan solution to this. And they, did it for months, and eventually they did get a bill out of the Finance Committee with 1 Republican vote, Senator Olympia Snowe from Maine, but she ultimately refused to vote for the final bill in the Senate because it had drifted a little bit more to include some of the elements from the Health Committee, which she was not in favor of. So it took a very long time in the Senate, and they finally had this historic Christmas Eve vote and passed the bill. Despite all of this incredible negative rhetoric that we've all been hearing for the last year, these bills really are about 80% similar. And it's the 20% where they're not that's caused all the conversation. So here are some things where they agree. Everyone agrees, both sides of the aisle actually, that there should be an individual mandate to purchase insurance. This is a really important issue because assuming that people will be able to afford it, and that's really where the rub comes. If we have a mandate to buy insurance in this country, then it will change the conversation that's been going on in Washington for the 200 plus years that this country's existed, from whether or not we should have insurance for everybody or whether or not everyone should have access to health care to how. Because when constituents can't buy or can't afford to buy health insurance policy, and they are now in violation of the law and they're being fined, they're going to call up their member of Congress and say, hey Joe, this does not fly. You need to fix this and make this something I can afford because I'm not a lawbreaker. I'm working 3 jobs here and I still can't afford to buy this thing, so you better fix this. And that will dramatically change the conversation going on in Washington in a really substantive way. So although the individual mandate's been somewhat controversial, I think at the end of the day, it will change future legislation in a way that will be very positive for people. Although there probably will be some short-term pain from this for some folks. Everyone agrees, too, that there needs to be increased, to be totally honest, the Republicans don't totally agree with all of these greatly increased regulations, but they agree with some of them. And so what those regulations are is that people cannot be denied insurance for pre-existing conditions, nor can they be dropped when they are sick, and that's called rescission. And that's happening in the individual insurance market for people who own their policies themselves. They pay their premiums all year, but during that year they get diabetes. When it's time to renew that premium or that policy, they find out that that policy is no longer available to them. That would be outlawed. It would eliminate annual and lifetime caps that insurance policies promote, and that would help tremendously for mental health coverage. People with needing mental health services run up to annual caps, usually within a couple of months. And also certain chemotherapy drugs are now running into these caps. And then there's something called the medical loss ratio. And what that means is how much of every premium dollar actually gets spent on health care versus administrative tasks or CEO bonuses, that sort of thing. And right now, companies are spending around, and this is of course all private health insurance companies, 70 cents of every dollar actually on health care. That would now be raised and be part of law that it would be either 80 or 85 cents of every premium dollar would actually go to health care. And then the House wants to eliminate the antitrust exemption. And health insurance companies and malpractice insurance companies are not covered by antitrust legislation, which is why you see these really highly concentrated markets all over the country. Then everyone is very much in agreement on expanding coverage for preventive medicine and primary care. And there's significant money in both the House and Senate bill that would go into primary care and public health infrastructure. There's incentives for small businesses to provide insurance. There's creation of a health insurance exchange, which is like a marketplace, like Travelocity for health insurance, and tremendous support for health information technology.